Occupy the Streets is, I think, one of those bright instances in an otherwise dismal picture. I've often said that urban safety is the civil rights movement of the 21st century, and people in Chicago agree. They will be uniting after another bloodbath to take to the streets, take to the corners, and while they may not consider themselves classic citizens on patrol, they are still taking back their community from persons I call chocolate Klansmen, individuals I've termed black zombies who have decided to make the inner city a horror show. We can look at our history of street organizations, and I don't mean the way Minister Farrakhan defines street organizations as a euphemism for street gangs. When I say street organizations, I'm talking about groups of law-abiding, often black citizens who walk the inner city, patrol the inner city in vehicles with the intention of preserving life and property, just like in higher income, just like in more pale zip codes. I think of great organizations like Concerned Black Men. I also think of Mad Dads. There's a particular place in my heart for the Detroit 300, a group of men of all colors and backgrounds who banded together in the midst of some of the most savage taking of life and rape that besieged city had ever experienced. Regrettably, despite doing great things and, I think, writing a bold new chapter in what responsible black men won't accept in their community, they disbanded after the murder of one of their members. But there is a bright spot. Batman 300, formerly of a previous organization, has started his own group, Detroit Street Watchers. And I hope that Detroit Street Watchers, just like this Occupy the Streets initiative, will take their rightful places in the 21st century as the contemporary equivalents of civil rights standard bearers like the Congress for Racial Equality, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the Deacons for Defense, or the NAACP, the Urban League, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and all these other groups that united against not only legalized apartheid and Jim Crow, but a very violent element, sometimes in law enforcement, sometimes in private organizations, other times just acting individually, but no less maliciously. Organizing against this type of violence at the height of the late 20th century civil rights movement should serve as an inspiration for those of us facing a different kind of violence to organize at the beginning of the 21st century. We can't blame skinheads, the Aryan Nation, even the encroaching, as a friend of mine called, caramel Klansmen coming across the border and using American blacks for target practice. Long before any of these groups work their evil in our community, we still have to acknowledge the fact that for various reasons, whether you want to say it's a divine curse, whether you want to say it's the lingering effects of slavery, whether you want to state that bad individual decision making is the culprit, whatever you decide is the reason, there's disproportionate violence in the inner city, and it can only be stopped by those persons closest to it. When men, not being sexist, and women in these communities decide that the stranger violence, the relative violence, the friend violence that is all too intimate and all too well known is unacceptable, that's when the murder rate goes down. That's when perhaps some hope of civility can be introduced into environments currently ruled by people who, frankly, I have continued to call chocolate Klansmen, and more recently, black zombies will continue to. The environment we find ourselves in is intolerable. No other group would accept being a hostage to percentages of their population who've abandoned any type of civility, any type of respect, any type of decency. I look at how the white community responded to their Jesse Jameses and their Dillingers from the Civil War period and the 1930s respectively. You know, while some people embrace them as folk heroes, the way, sadly, a lot of gangster rappers and literal gangsters in our streets are lauded today, many more people united against it and provided the public will, which in turn energized the political will to make these individuals public enemies number one. It's ridiculous that little old ladies who have survived some of the greatest challenges of contemporary American life, not just the death of their male spouses, but also, take your pick, the Great Depression, World War II, a Cold War which literally held the fate of humanity in the balance, and, to top it all off, turning the page on America's human rights struggle. To survive all of these cataclysmic events, only to spend your waning years entombed within your home, behind burglar bars and steel security doors, as I've seen my grandmother, her neighbors, and too many of their peers have to do in the name of basic survival throughout the inner city of America. Lest we forget, a Tuskegee Airman, a man who fought Nazis in the skies over France and elsewhere, was robbed at gunpoint, not by a crooked cop, not by some skinhead, not by a swastika-wearing neo-Nazi, but by young black men who weren't even moved by the fact that he was a senior citizen, let alone a decorated war hero. Reaching a little further back in contemporary history, no less than Rosa Parks, the woman whose stance on the bus provided so much moral capital and boosted morale to energize a movement which ultimately was responsible for my not being a second-class citizen, because I was a generation born immediately in the wake after her actions. Even Rosa Parks was attacked and beaten by a chocolate Klansman, by a drug addict, by a black zombie who knew exactly who she was, but that did not stop him from abusing her and taking her property. This is where we find ourselves, with a lack of self-respect that not only has become annoying, but too often lethal. When people say that they're going to occupy the streets in one city, we should be seriously considering occupying the streets in all cities. The civil rights movement of the late 20th century had an external threat which had to be addressed. It even had internal accomplices, as history has revealed. Now we find ourselves in the 21st century facing a threat that is all too familiar and all too close to home. If we fail to occupy our streets, then who do we blame when the rest of society decides that martial law, tanks, National Guardsmen, militarized police, and even federal troops are necessary to govern us because we failed to govern ourselves? Against this grim backdrop I painted, I still want to commend everybody involved with the upcoming Occupy the Streets campaign in Chicago, and invite everybody who cares about the future of not only our segment of America, but our nation as a whole, to seriously consider occupying the streets where we live. Because once again, if we do not govern ourselves, believe me, somebody else will.